I hate to suggest this, but my guess would be marijuana.
Unlawful substance used to experience artificial highs.
What's this?
Slow down,
A
slow,
joint?
slow.
So what's the big
Slow down,
attraction?
dude.
I mean, how does it...
6 decades, thousands of incarcerations, millions of lives lost, and more than $1 billion have been spent fighting America's war on drugs, with a disastrous results. Since President Nixon's declaration of war on drugs in 1971, America's prison population has grown exponentially. Federal law enforcement has heavily targeted minorities across the country, and the ridiculous classification of less harmful drugs such as marijuana with the most harmful like heroin have been the result of America's failed war on drugs, as well as the wasted $1 trillion in taxpayer spending to fuel the war. The colossal failure that this war on drugs has been solely attributed to America's fixture to punish drug abusers. In order to reverse the failure that President Nixon started in 1971, as well as presidents after him, America should not be wasting taxpayer money to incarcerate its own citizens, but instead to effectively shift the policy from a punish-first system to a treatment program and to ultimately decriminalize the possession and personal consumption amount of illicit drugs. Prohibition and the drug war share a very similar resemblance with one another, as law enforcement is seen getting rid of the unlawful substances and attempting to rid America of both drugs and alcohol. But in their similarities, a large difference divides them. Prohibition lasted for a little over a decade, while the war on drugs has spanned 4 decades and different generations of Americans. Both of them even saw a rise in nonviolent offenders being incarcerated. But no doubt, the drug war has put more people in prison than there were probably people drinking during Prohibition. America's prison population since the start of the war has skyrocketed, with 50% of our inmates being non-violent drug offenders and 16% of them being in for possession of drugs only. The graph shows the number of incarcerated Americans from 1920 to 2014, and as you can see, the large spike starting after President Nixon declared a war on drugs in the 1970s. Since then, incarcerated Americans has increased more than 5 times since the beginning of Prohibition, the majority of incarcerated Americans being African American, Latino, and Hispanic. The war on drugs draws its very racial roots to before the war began, when in the 1920s in the South, cocaine correlated to black violence according to the segregated white community. In the West, Mexican and Asian men supposedly lured white women to opium dens or to smoke marijuana in order to have sex with them. Since then, minorities have been paying the price through prison time due to those false and outdated propaganda. Now take a look at these two non-violent drug offenders. Which one served more time in prison? Carrie Blakinger, the white woman shown here, was caught on her college campus with about $56,000 worth of heroin, yet received a 2.5-year sentence. She only served 21 months, while Bernard Noble, seen with his daughter, has been serving 13 years of prison time for about 2 joints worth of weed. Both were arrested in states with strict drug laws, yet one served less than the other for a highly dangerous drug, all because of white privilege. The judicial system is at fault for these unfair decisions and needs to be reformed with the federal and state drug laws that are enacted today. The American people have called for reform after seeing the failed war on drugs, and public opinion has changed drastically since the war started. A huge step for reform would be to start legalizing the safest drug on the list of illegal substances. That drug is marijuana. Beginning in the 2000s, all 3 generations began to slowly support legalization of marijuana throughout the new millennium. Politicians and representatives have lobbied for legalization, listening to the growing dissent of many Americans over the war on drugs.
Thank you, Mr. President. Of course, I want to continue the moratorium so we can work this all out. But you know what I'd like to see? We just had a huge meeting of city workers who might lose their jobs. How about creating a revenue stream for marijuana? First of all, many of you know that I have said the laws of the 80s are bad laws. We have people in prison who shouldn't be in prison to begin with. So when are we going to grow up as a nation and deal with the reality of marijuana? Instead of incarcerating people, let's deal with it in an honesty and an integrity way. But what I want to do now is every one of these clinics that ends up legitimate after this process we go through, we need to come up with a formula so that the city gets a piece of that revenue so that we can deal with our deficit. In my 64 years on this planet, I've heard more criticism about marijuana than I do about alcohol, and we know that alcohol creates issues. And I'm tired of gutless politicians that always talk about the war on crime and they mix marijuana in the same mix. That's wrong and crazy. And my last comment, Mr. President, is that we have 2.3 million people in prison, more than any other place on the planet. We are 5% of the world's population, yet we have 25% of the world's incarceration. The state budget is in total disarray. We have 60,000 prison guards. Well, let's start releasing these people from prison, and let's start dealing with it as a health issue and not a criminal issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendahl.
In order to effectively end the war on drugs without drastic repercussions, America must successfully model its state and federal drug laws after a successful drug policy like that of Portugal, who in 2000 changed its policy from a prison time sentence to that of a medical treatment program if the citizen had in his or her possession more than a 10-day supply of any illegal substance. This decriminalizing act led to a fall in drug use of all kinds from 16-year-olds to 25-year-olds. Not only that, America should also create a revenue stream made out of less harmful and beneficial drugs like marijuana to bring in money that would normally go to organized crime, but instead to direct it into the state and federal's revenue. 6 decades, thousands of incarcerations, millions of lives lost, and more than $1 billion have been spent fighting America's war on drugs, with disastrous results. Since President Nixon's declaration of war on drugs in 1971, America's prison population has grown exponentially. Federal law enforcement has heavily targeted minorities across the country, and the ridiculous classification of less harmful drugs such as marijuana with the most harmful like heroin have been the result of America's failed war on drugs, as well as the wasted $1 trillion taxpayer money to fuel the war. This colossal failure, this war on drugs, has been solely attributed to America's fixture to punish drug abusers. In order to reverse the failure that President Nixon started in 1971, as well as carried out by presidents after him, America should not be wasting taxpayer money to incarcerate its own citizens, but instead to effectively shift the policy from a punish-first system to a treatment program, and to ultimately decriminalize the possession of personal consumption amount of illicit drugs.
The rhymes just shots I lost in that sauce and pasta. My green thumb touched a leaf beyond a cigarello. Put me in a coma for days as a sleeping weller. I was never blind, my nigga. I've been open the window. Too much smoke whipping here like Willow. Mine is still on the pillow. Shit, god damn. Just to think. Hot 97 and there's still roaches on in my sink. As the clock tick too much hours, I'll be in